Hey there, I'm Dr. Mike Parent. I am one of Telemedica's providers who does assessments with veterans. I'm here to talk today about the mind-body connection as it applies to PTSD. I'm a licensed psychologist. I live in Austin, Texas, although I do a form of interjurisdictional practice called PsyPac that allows me to practice in 20-some states. So getting an assessment in a couple of different states, you might see me as one of the potential appointments. I've been a licensed psychologist for a couple of years now, almost a decade, and I've been a boarded psychologist for about a year. I've been with Telemedica for a few months now. I'm also an associate professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Austin, and I work on training some upcoming psychologists in that role. So as I said, I'll be talking a bit about the mind-body connection and PTSD. I'll touch on three big areas related to that. One is the nature of how the body influences our risk for getting PTSD when we're exposed to potential stressors. People inherit different levels of risk for different kinds of mental health conditions. Maybe a bit more obvious than PTSD, we might think about how this works with depression. Most of us probably know someone who has had, maybe seemingly not that depressing life. So not a huge amount of personal stressors, not a huge amount of traumas or losses in their life, but can still develop some pretty profound symptoms of depression. That might be in part because that person might inherit a pretty profound genetic risk for depression. In contrast, many of us also know people who have undergone immense hardships in their lives and don't have depression, maybe even are unusually positive and upbeat or optimistic. Such a person might be that way, at least in part, because they might have inherited less genetic risk for depression. In the same way, people can inherit different levels of susceptibility to a condition like PTSD. It gets a little bit more complicated with PTSD because a diagnosis of PTSD requires, as a part of it, exposure to trauma. And of course, not everyone in their life is going to be exposed to traumas or the same degrees of trauma. And so someone might inherit a genetic risk for PTSD from their parents, but their parents might not have had PTSD because perhaps their parents never got exposed to those kinds of intense stressors. So our bodies are related to our risk for PTSD in terms of that genetic potential, but that genetic potential has to work through some sort of stressors, which of course many people in the military can be exposed to, but many civilians, so veterans' parents, for example, if they were civilians, might not have been exposed to or might have been exposed to in different ways. So that's the first way that our body can influence how PTSD becomes established. It's important to note, too, that PTSD is a pretty significant and nuanced condition. And so just having one symptom of, say, nightmares or avoidance or having been exposed to reminders of death or one's own mortality might not be sufficient to meet criteria for PTSD according to our diagnostic guidelines. A second way that the mind and body are connected in terms of PTSD is in people's experiences of PTSD. PTSD can often cause pretty substantial physical manifestations in folks that could include things like physical distress, physiological distress, like headaches, tension headaches, gastrointestinal upset, all sorts of things like that. Really common are sleep problems that can be related to nightmares, but sometimes just having a lot of trouble falling asleep and staying asleep without necessarily having nightmares. Or sometimes people have nightmares and don't get told that until they, move in with a partner or something like that, and the partner says, do you know that you thrash around in your sleep 5 nights a week? And maybe the patient doesn't even recall having nightmares. PTSD can also cause physical symptoms like avoidance, avoiding reminders of past traumas, and having a low interest in activities the person used to find enjoyable. someone might have enjoyed going out to fireworks shows or going out to big crowded concerts before developing PTSD. And after PTSD, might find themselves withdrawing socially and physically from other people. A third way that the mind and body can be connected in terms of PTSD is in terms of comorbid conditions. Comorbid conditions essentially mean that there's more than one thing happening for the patient. As I mentioned before, a really common comorbid condition for PTSD is sleep problems. That can include what we call problems with sleep onset, or having trouble falling asleep, waking multiple times during the night, sometimes being aware of nightmares, sometimes not, and then being unable to get back to sleep. So once a person has woken up, many of us wake up in the night, go to the bathroom, or have a few minutes of wakefulness or something, and then just fall back asleep. Many people with PTSD, though, will find themselves after they wake up unable to get back to sleep. Sometimes these problems can become so severe that they have only 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night. When that happens over the course of weeks, then months, and then years, if there's no treatment, people can begin to experience pretty profound physical and body symptoms related to that from that extreme and prolonged sleep deprivation. That can include anything from getting ill a lot easier because the immune system starts to get weakened, just being able to focus and concentrate less, because without having your brain be able to repair itself during sleep, there's sort of progressive damage done to the brain that takes away from people's ability to maintain attention or motivation. Exercise is, of course, a good treatment for mental health, but sometimes folks with PTSD can find themselves inhibited to engage in exercise. They might struggle to go to a gym because it tends to be crowded, and there aren't a huge number of 24-hour gyms that might be options to go to late at night. That might be limited in a lot of areas. People with PTSD might also have some comorbid physical conditions. If, for example, the PTSD is related to, or even independent of the PTSD, the person got injured in some way. So they might have trouble exercising because of some other existing injuries. We can also have problems with PTSD if the patient begins to alarm others with some of their symptoms. So if, for example, they hear a firework go off, set off by some neighborhood kids, then they go into the garage and start loading up their guns, the person's partner or family might become upset by that and distressed in a lot of ways. So that expression of PTSD is comorbid conditions that can impact us physically and relationally is another way in which PTSD and physical conditions can be interconnected. The good news is, though, that there is assistance available for people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. Treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder, which are centrally a treatment called prolonged exposure, has been found to be very, very helpful for people in dealing with their PTSD symptoms. In my own private practice, I've seen many people with PTSD and seen substantial progress over the course of even just a couple of weeks of treatment with prolonged exposure. Nightmares have their own treatment as well, called imagery rescripting, which is a little not dramatic. I like to call it nightmare rescripting. That sounds a little bit more flashy. But that condition also involves being able to revise and then re-experience recurring nightmares. It works especially well on nightmares that are recurring rather than ones that are sort of one-off. So despite those potential challenges that people might face with PTSD, there is help available both through the VA and through community providers, as well as assessments through telemedica that can help people to understand if their problems are related to PTSD, and then to help to understand if that PTSD might be related to experiences in the service. Of course, as I mentioned, just having one or two of the symptoms of PTSD is typically not enough to meet full criteria for having post-traumatic stress disorder, getting a diagnosis, and then even if a diagnosis is made, having it be service-connected. But that kind of assessment can be the first step toward receiving some assistance for PTSD symptoms. I think the Telemedica folks are going to open it up for some questions. If anybody has any questions, either about PTSD, happy to answer questions about the treatment of it, which you might experience if you go to a community provider or the VA, or are there such questions? In what ways can I facilitate mind-body healing? Exercise, if it's possible, is a really good way. And so usually the recommendation is whatever things people can do that fit within their lives. So if PTSD makes it kind of inhibiting to be in a gym, which has many entrances and there's a lot of people going around, there might be loud music, it might be activating or distressing or just aversive in a lot of different ways, finding some way to engage in some form of exercise, even if that's, getting a boxing stand to put in your garage, doing yoga in the morning, something like that, something that fits with you, that's physical and meets your needs, is a good start to facilitate that. And the activity you engage in should be rewarding to you. It should be something you want to do, or else it's not going to be rewarding to you and feel like it's benefiting you. What are signs that my PTSD may be getting worse? So it's not uncommon for people to not experience the most intense symptoms of PTSD immediately after. It's not exactly like a broken bone or something like that. With a broken bone, you probably feel worse immediately after, and then it gets set and it heals and it sort of dissipates. With PTSD, it's not uncommon to experience what's called delayed onset, or the experience of new symptoms arising or symptoms becoming worse over a little bit of time. Sometimes that's months, and sometimes it's maybe even a year after the actual traumatic event. So that might be the onset of more severe avoidance symptoms. So not going to places people used to go to, finding oneself becoming more irritable, especially at like family members and such, finding oneself having nightmares that weren't happening before. So basically, if those symptoms of PTSD are changing, especially increasing in severity, and it's not uncommon, as I said, for new symptoms to onset, even months or a year after the actual traumatic event that occurred. How is PTSD and mood disorder symptoms similar or different? That's a great question. There is a lot of overlap between many of the disorders. So for example, PTSD symptoms include a loss of enjoyment of things people used to enjoy engaging in, which is also really similar to what symptoms of depression are. Or people with PTSD might experience a marked physiological response to things that they find stressful, which is really similar to what anxiety looks like. Mood disorders are, in terms of if one is diagnosed with a mood disorder as a subset of PTSD, mood disorders are sort of in one area of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is what we use to determine what diagnoses to give people if one is warranted. Trauma-related disorders are set in another category, but the categories are somewhat arbitrarily defined. The reality is that people experience a huge amount of overlap between the different conditions, and part of the assessor's job is to determine which conditions best explain the symptoms the person is experiencing. So it's entirely possible, for example, to have PTSD and, say, major depressive disorder. One difference, though, is that major depressive disorder usually starts onsetting in adolescence. So most people who end up having major depressive disorder already had some of the signs of it when they were 13, 15, 17 years old. Whereas PTSD, a person might have no symptoms until they experience some kind of pronounced trauma at like age 30 or something like that. So considerably beyond adolescence. So we would pay a lot of attention to exactly when the symptoms started or got worse. to determine if one disorder explains things better than another, or a person can have more than one condition as well. So that's one of the most complex jobs of the person doing the assessment, is to figure out kind of how the pattern works and whether something kind of onset multiple disorders. Maybe an example of the sort of subset thing is that PTSD and panic disorder share a lot of the same things, but you can usually fully explain panic-like symptoms with PTSD rather than giving an entirely separate diagnosis of panic disorder. It's usually just the case that the panic arises because of the PTSD. What dietary foods and supplements help with mental health? Oh, that's a great question too. If you want your body to output healthy things, you should probably input healthy things into it. Not being a dietitian, I probably can't give really specific advice, but I would encourage you to talk to your doctor. There are many online resources by people who are dietitians to give you some guidance on this. But generally eating what people would recommend as healthy foods, so generally unprocessed foods, make sure you're getting enough fruits and vegetables, and trying to avoid heavily processed foods and fast foods would be generally good advice. If you want to learn more, I think that registered dietitians' websites can give some good guidance, and of course, consulting with an actual dietitian will be better than me, who just reads the websites and tries to figure out the best things to eat. Have you seen many people with PTSD and chronic costochondritis? No physical event that has caused the severe pain. I have not personally. Most of the people I see have had physical events happen that cause any sorts of pain that they're experiencing chronically. But that's not to say that those two conditions can't be related in some way. It's, in my personal experience, most of the people I've seen for PTSD, like I said, have had considerable physical injuries as well. Though that's certainly not the rule with PTSD. It doesn't have to involve some sort of injury that causes prolonged physical chronic pain. And of course, a sort of phrase in treatment is the patient can have as many conditions as they darn well please. And so it's important for providers and folks in general to not try to find the one thing that explains everything, like happens on some TV shows. It's always this one magic condition that explains everything. A person can have two or three things that kind of all interact. I was never in combat, but so this is an excellent question. I have never been in combat, but I have been diagnosed with service-connected PTSD. Is guilt and anxiety a symptom of PTSD, or is it just depression? So first, it's very important to dispel this concern that some people have that, I wasn't shot 4 times, or I didn't, suffer this intense, severe injury, and so I couldn't have PTSD. If you think back to what I said about the genetic risk, some people will be shot 4 times or something like that, some really intense event, and not develop PTSD because they have such low genetic risk for it. Other folks will experience what I wouldn't use this word, but what some people might call more minor or sort of less intense stressors, and still develop PTSD. The criteria for PTSD include things like finding out about the sudden or violent death of someone you know. It doesn't have to even be a direct personal experience, although that's very much more often the cause of it. Maybe a simple example, not dealing with the military, is like sometimes people get PTSD if they're at a stoplight. They're just sitting there waiting for it to turn green, and they witness like a really horrible traffic accident happen right in front of them, maybe even witnessing people die right in front of them. That person suffered no physical damage, but can absolutely still develop PTSD from that. And they might experience even things like guilt or anxiety. They might have, again, just using this traffic thing as an example, they might think something like, what if I had seen this? Why shouldn't I have been looking up? I was on my phone. I should have honked and brought their attention to it. I should have done something. I should have edged ahead and maybe they would have seen me and both of those cars would have stopped. Or if you're in the military, even having thoughts like, if I literally people having thoughts like, if I had gotten up 5 minutes earlier and done this or talked to this person, you spent 2 minutes talking to me before he went out and he ended up getting killed on that mission. Those kinds of thoughts are very, very common. And that kind of guilt is in the criteria for PTSD. And it's very common for people to experience that. Some people will call it survivor's guilt. Um, Although it can certainly be manifest in different ways, like the car example. That person wasn't exactly a survivor of that car accident, they just witnessed it. But it can absolutely arise from situations like that. And that kind of anxiety, guilt is a common manifestation of PTSD. If I am a combat vet from Vietnam, rated 50% disability, was told I don't need treatment, how do you know if treatment is needed? I would say a lot of people can benefit from mental health treatment in general. But if you're having symptoms that are sort of classic of PTSD, if the PTSD is not classified as what we call in remission, which means the symptoms have dissipated to the point where the person is no longer diagnosable, I would encourage you to seek treatment. If that's not through the VA, it can be through a community provider. Um, Trying to find one who's more familiar with veteran experiences is a good idea. I've worked with veterans from the Vietnam era before, um, who had PTSD, who are like decades with nightmares multiple times a week, and it's really heartbreaking to see people maybe having their symptoms dismissed if you're still experiencing symptoms. So I'd encourage you perhaps to get a second opinion on whether no treatment is needed. It might be the case that no treatment is needed for the PTSD, but maybe something else is going on that would benefit from treatment. So what you're saying is we want to look at address the symptoms. So a diagnostic code is what we use to kind of classify people and to what they're experiencing. But it's really important to note that people don't all experience their symptoms in the same way. There are people who meet criteria for PTSD who don't have nightmares, for example. Another good example is depression. So this happens a lot with men experiencing profound depression, but it doesn't get expressed as tearfulness or crying. They're punching holes in walls and going out and getting drunk and getting into fights. It's getting what we call externalized rather than internalized. But at the underlying part of it is still that they're feeling very unhappy and very distressed about their current situation in life. And so it's important to not view the diagnosis as a label that means that everybody with this diagnosis is looking exactly the same and should be treated exactly the same way. It's really important to know the exact symptoms the person is experiencing and how those symptoms can be addressed in a holistic way that takes into account the person's individual needs, their contexts, their strengths, their resources, their family situation, all those sorts of things, so that treatment can be optimized. Like I said, some people with PTSD won't experience nightmares, although that's a very common symptom. Can you recommend non-traditional resources or community assistance for those living with PTSD? Non-traditional resources, I think getting a lot of community support from one's community and whatever community that happens to be. So if one is a little older, it might be through like seniors living organizations. If one is a member of the LGBT community, it might be through those resources. If someone is in recovery for substances, it might be through those resources. I think just generally kind of getting any kind of support that can be helpful can help to sort of raise the tide and help the boat along, even if it's not directly addressing the specific symptoms of PTSD. Although my general recommendation would be mental health assistance with a person who does prolonged exposure. But if folks don't want to do that, if it's not available to them in their area, if it's not accessible, if it's too expensive, I think any of those community resources that fit with you as a person can help to kind of, like I said, raise the tide and raise the boat somewhat, even if it's not maybe the most specific mental health treatment that might be available. What documents do I need in order to get a psych evaluation with Telemedica? So there are a couple documents listed. If you're working with a coach, the coach can certainly help you. Telemedica also has FAQs, or frequently asked questions, about those documents, and can help you through the process. The kind of essential documents being some medical records, DD-214s, e-benefits, documents, and things like that. But there's certainly sort of helpful lists of the things that would be good to upload into the system if you sign up for an assessment. Oh, that looks to be the end of the questions that are coming through. I do hope this was helpful to folks in terms of how you're thinking about PTSD and that mind-body connection, and I hope that those were helpful answers to some of your questions. Oh wait, there's one more question. I have a little chat thing open. Good question. Due to current events happening in Afghanistan, what advice would you give to veterans trying to cope with it all? My first thought would be that is an amazingly, shockingly intense thing to be going through right now. And if you need help, trust me, you are not alone in terms of the veterans who are experiencing an enormous amount of stress. Getting communications from people they know in Afghanistan who are trying to escape, getting communications from people who are trying to escape who have had family members be killed, or things like that, who are unable to leave. Many veterans are under an extreme amount of stress right now. My main suggestion would be to see if you can find a provider who has nearby openings if you're open to individual treatment. There are many groups that happen in VAs and VA outpatient clinics, for example, where people can connect to other veterans, many of whom are going to be having similar experiences right now. So those kind of individual or group things, even if you can informally organize something on some veteran Facebook group for your city, just to get together and be able to talk a little bit about some of this happening, or maybe not even talk, maybe distract yourselves for an hour from the really terrifying situation that's happening to people you might know. Whatever your needs are, if it's talking, if it's a reprieve from thinking about it all day long, reaching out to your family if you're close to your family, and if they might be amenable to listening for a bit, might be helpful. It's really going to be an individual thing in terms of how to deal with this enormous stress. I wish I could say with any confidence that it was limited in some sort of time period and won't be prolonged, but we don't really know that, and fearful that it might be prolonged. And so being able to connect to those resources, in particular with the foresight of that this might continue to be stressful for a while, is probably my best advice for that. Okay, those are all the questions for today. Thank you all for taking the time to tune in and listen for this time. I hope that was helpful.